The Germans once believed their engineering was the finest in the world, until they opened the hood of a strange vehicle called the Willys. November 1942. The North African desert, a land of scorching winds, golden sands, and desperate retreats. After their defeat at El Alamein, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps was pulling back westward under constant pressure from the British and fresh American troops newly landed on the continent. Amid the wreckage of a battlefield, charred vehicle frames, exploded fuel drums, truck carcasses half buried in the sand, a German reconnaissance unit spotted something unusual. A small, low-slung vehicle painted a pale olive, unlike anything they had ever seen. Oberleutnant Franz Müller, the unit commander, stepped closer and brushed off a thick layer of sand from the dashboard. Under the harsh sunlight, a clear inscription appeared. Willys MB. He frowned. An American vehicle? What kind is this? Then turned and ordered, "Call Karl Reinhardt over. Bring the motor pool team. I want to see if it still runs." Karl Reinhardt, a senior mechanic sergeant who had worked for 10 years at the Opel factory in Kassel, stepped forward. He said nothing, simply bent down and opened the hood. In that moment, under the blazing desert sun, a middle-aged German soldier looked into the heart of a strange vehicle and saw something he had never encountered in his life. Not power, not sophistication, but a simplicity that bordered on perfection. The wires were color-coded, the pipes neatly arranged, bolts of standard size. Everything could be disassembled with just a few ordinary wrenches. Nothing was excessive, no decorative elements. Every detail served one purpose: easy to repair, easy to replace, easy to understand. Reinhardt murmured, almost to himself, "Strange. It's built so that someone who knows nothing about machines can still fix it." Another soldier asked, "What do you mean?" He replied in a low voice, "It means they know their soldiers will have to fend for themselves on the battlefield. They didn't build this for engineers. They built it for farmers." The group fell silent. In the world of German engineering, where every bolt was machined to 1,000th of a millimeter, simple was synonymous with crude. But here, in this little machine, simplicity had become a strength. The Willys MB, also known as the Jeep, used a 2.2-liter, 4-cylinder Go Devil engine with just 60 horsepower, a modest number that might have made many German engineers chuckle. But in war, horsepower wasn't everything. What mattered was that it always started, always ran, and anyone could fix it. Oberleutnant Müller crossed his arms, watching Karl examine the gear lever. "Anything special?" Karl pointed at a small lever. "Just one lever, but it gives you 4-wheel drive. No fuss, no error." When they started the engine, it ran smoothly, cleanly, decisively. The vehicle slowly crawled over the soft sand where the German Kübelwagen would usually get stuck. No running start, no pushing. It just kept going. Steady. Calm. Karl stood still, watching. In his mind appeared images of factories in Kassel, Stuttgart, Wolfsburg, where German engineers meticulously measured every specification, tested every joint. They believed sophistication was the soul of engineering. But right now, in the desert, he understood. There was another kind of perfection. Perfection through effectiveness. That night, Karl wrote in his notebook, "This vehicle isn't powerful, isn't beautiful, but it was built to endure. Everything serves one single purpose, to help the soldier keep moving forward. Maybe that's what real engineering is." And he didn't know that, from that moment on, he had begun a journey from pride to understanding, from faith in German engineering to admiration for the American industrial spirit. A journey that would last the rest of his life. Karl Reinhardt woke up before dawn. The desert wind still howled, blowing sand across the tarp covering the Willys MB. For the past 3 days, his motor team had done what Germans did best: inspect, measure, dismantle, and reassemble every part. But the more they worked, the more Carl felt something indescribable, a mix of admiration and confusion. This little American vehicle had nothing luxurious, no complex components, no secret technology. But the more he observed it, the more he understood. It was made so anyone could grasp it, anyone could build it. When he reported back, Oberleutnant Müller frowned. "Sounds like you're praising the enemy, Reinhardt." Carl replied quietly, "I'm just stating the facts, sir. If we want to understand why they're growing stronger by the day, we should start with this simple thing." They continued testing the vehicle. The Jeep was driven through soft sand, pulled a light artillery gun, and carried 7 men up a rocky slope. In every test, it succeeded without preparation. Meanwhile, the German Kübelwagens, lighter and more refined, often needed carefully planned routes. When the engine stopped, Carl removed the spark plugs and smiled. "We could replace this whole set in just 10 minutes. A young soldier's eyes widened. 10 minutes? It takes us an hour on our vehicles." Carl nodded. That's the difference. In 1942, America had only been at war for a year. But in that short time, they had created something unprecedented in human history. An industry that could manufacture war like it produced consumer goods. Just this small vehicle Carl was testing, the Willys MB, also known as the Jeep, was produced on a massive scale. From 1941 to 1945, the U.S. built over 640,000 units, split between 2 factories, Willys Overland in Toledo and the Ford Motor Company in Michigan. 2 different manufacturers, yet every bolt, every joint was fully compatible. Apart from a Ford Jeep could fit perfectly on a Willys Jeep with no modification. That was something Germany, with dozens of military vehicle makers, had never accomplished. In his notebook, Carl wrote, "Every part of the Jeep is the same, from one vehicle to the next. They didn't try to build the best car, they built the easiest car to build. And because of that, they could make hundreds of thousands." The story spread quickly through the unit. Other mechanical engineers came to see. At first, they mocked. "American vehicles are crude, heavy, no finesse at all." But just a few hours later, after taking it apart themselves, everyone went quiet. They realized what Carl had seen from the beginning. This was a completely different way of thinking. Oberleutnant Müller asked Carl, "How many of these do you think they can make?" Carl replied, "According to intelligence reports, America produces tens of thousands of vehicles per week. Just the Jeep alone, maybe several thousand each month." Müller was stunned. "Impossible," Carl answered calmly. "Sir, with a production system like this, nothing is impossible." At that very time, Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan was achieving the impossible, completing a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes, 24 per day. Over 700 per month, a number no German engineer could have imagined. At the shipyards on the East Coast, Americans were launching Liberty ships, cargo vessels over 130 meters long, in 5 to 6 weeks instead of the usual 8 months. At peak efficiency, one was completed in just 5 days, a record no nation could match. War, once a contest of guns and bullets, had become a battle of assembly lines and labor forces. In North Africa, Rommel's soldiers felt it firsthand. On the supply routes, American trucks appeared more and more, crossing sandy terrain that German vehicles couldn't. Jeeps flooded the front lines, as if sprouting from the earth itself. Every time the Germans captured one, they dismantled it, studied it, and came away impressed. One German officer once wrote in a report to the High Command, "We build for absolute precision. The Americans build for limitless scale. In total war, the latter is far more terrifying. Karl didn't know if that report ever reached Berlin, but he understood, even if it did, no one would listen. Germany still believed intricate engineering was the key to victory. But out there, among the wrecked vehicles, Karl began to see the truth. Victory belonged to those who could fix their machines faster, not build them more complicated. On the third night, he sat by an oil lamp and wrote the final line in his journal. "If I were chief engineer, I'd tell everyone, learn from the Americans. They don't build castles, they build houses, mass-produced. And it's those simple houses that are swallowing our empire." The next day, the Afrika Korps received orders to retreat to Tunisia. The captured jeep led the convoy, still running smoothly, still strong. No one saw it as a crude enemy vehicle anymore. It had become the most reliable transport in the unit, and a silent symbol of something the Germans were beginning to fear. They weren't just losing on the battlefield, they were losing in the factory. May 1943. Tunisia had fallen. Rommel's Afrika Korps was cornered, with no way out. On May 13th, more than 250,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms. The North African campaign was over. Karl Reinhardt stood in a long line of prisoners, watching American trucks roll in. None of them looked like German vehicles. They were larger, cruder, painted gray-blue, yet moved effortlessly over the sand. On the beds of the trucks, the white lettering U.S. Army stood out in the sunlight. Inside, the engines purred evenly and steadily, the kind of sound Karl could listen to endlessly without ever hearing a flaw. On the way to the port, Karl and his comrades were transported in American vehicles. He couldn't take his eyes off the dashboard. Clear gauges, a light steering wheel, simple gear shift. The young soldier driving, barely 20, with no technical training, handled it with ease. He spoke broken German. "Willis, good car, yeah?" Karl simply nodded, his eyes filled with equal parts curiosity and admiration. As the Liberty ship carrying the prisoners departed, Karl stood on deck, watching other ships being launched continuously from the shipyard. Every week, dozens of vessels like that left port. They weren't elegant or refined, but they were massive and complete. A fellow officer whispered, "They build ships faster than we build coffins." The words sent a chill down Karl's spine. After weeks at sea, they arrived in Norfolk, Virginia. From the port, the prisoners were transported by train across the United States to Camp Hearn in Texas. It was a quiet little town amid vast prairies. But the prison camp was enormous. Barbed wire fences, guard towers, rows of barracks. What shocked Karl wasn't the scale, but the order. Everything ran like a factory. Meal times, work shifts, rest periods, all to the minute. Supplies arrived steadily, food was abundant, equipment was never lacking. War, it seemed, hadn't deprived America of anything. In 1943, while Germany was running out of fuel and cutting civilian rations, America's highways were still filled with supply trucks. Weapon, vehicle, aircraft, and warship factories ran day and night. The U.S. didn't just go to war, they brought the entire nation into the production line. At Camp Hearn, skilled prisoners were invited to work in the technical zone, where vehicles were maintained for the U.S. Army. Karl signed up immediately. The shop was run by a young sergeant named Bill Andrews, who spoke halting German and had previously worked as a mechanic at Ford's Willow Run plant. On the first day, Bill gave Karl a tour. Rows of jeeps, Dodge trucks, M3 half-tracks, ambulances, troop carriers. All painted the same, laid out the same, using the same parts. Bill spoke with a hint of pride. "We design everything so parts are interchangeable. A bolt from a Jeep fits a truck. One oil filter works for 3 different engines." Karl listened closely, then asked, But aren't you sacrificing precision for that? Bill smiled. We don't need perfection. We need good enough, and a lot of it. War doesn't wait for perfectionists. Bill continued. In America, each worker is trained to do one task, fast and correctly. They don't have to be engineers, just know their step. The assembly line takes care of the rest. In Germany, each vehicle is hand-built by skilled craftsmen. In America, thousands of workers build parts simultaneously, resulting in output 10 times higher. One afternoon, Bill showed Carl the Jeep maintenance manual. A sturdy cover printed clearly. TM 9803, Technical Manual for 14-ton 4x4 truck, Willys MB and Ford GPW. Inside were diagrams of every part and procedure. A small line on the first page made Carl smile. This manual is written for the average soldier. In Germany, technical manuals were for engineers. In America, they were for everyone. Carl flipped through the pages, and a strange feeling stirred in him. Respect. Not for the enemy, but for a philosophy that placed the ordinary person at the center of engineering. In the days that followed, Carl and other German prisoners helped maintain vehicles for the U.S. Army at the camp. The work was steady, disciplined, and always well supplied. When parts were needed, they simply wrote down a code. The next day, a truck delivered it. No waiting, no paperwork, no permission required. The American supply system worked like a giant organism, each cell operating in perfect coordination. Carl thought to himself, this is real strength, not just machines, but how people organize, how they trust one another. Over 2 years at Camp Herne, Karl Reinhardt and hundreds of other German mechanics gradually uncovered the secret of American power: simplicity, standardization, and belief in the capabilities of ordinary people. America didn't need geniuses to run the country. They needed millions of workers who knew exactly what to do. During the same time in Europe, German factories were bombed out, oil supplies dried up, railroads destroyed. It took weeks to assemble one truck. Meanwhile, in 1943 alone, American factories built over 2 million military vehicles, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. One autumn evening in 1944, Bill and Carl sat drinking coffee in the shop. Bill shared, "Before I enlisted, I worked at Willow Run, the world's largest factory. When I left, they were rolling out a bomber every 63 minutes. Carl was stunned. A B-24 every hour? Bill nodded. That's right, our whole country works like that. Carl was silent for a long time. He understood. No strategy could ever defeat that kind of number. In early 1945, the war in Europe neared its end. News of the Ardennes offensive reached the camp. Hitler had thrown in all remaining forces to push back the Allies. An American told Carl with a grin, "They'll run out of gas before they reach Antwerp." And that's exactly what happened. German divisions were forced to abandon tanks due to fuel shortages. Meanwhile, here in America, millions of fuel barrels were being produced, packed, and shipped to Europe every single day. Carl sighed and wrote in his journal, "We didn't lose for lack of courage. We lost because we had nothing left to support that courage." May 1945. The camp radio announced Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war was over. Bill shook Carl's hand and said simply, "It's over, my friend. You'll go home, but don't forget what you saw here." Carl smiled, his voice hoarse and low. "I won't forget. I've learned more here than in all my years of schooling." From within a POW camp in Texas, a German mechanic had learned the greatest lesson of his life. The true strength of a nation doesn't lie in a few geniuses. It lies in its ability to turn their ideas into the actions of millions of ordinary people. Karl Reinhardt was once again adrift at sea, but this time not in defeat, but on a journey home. The repatriation ship left New York in early 1946, bound for Bremerhaven. Standing on deck, Karl watched the American skyline fade into the horizon, the place where he had learned lessons found in no technical academy. When the ship docked, the first sight left him speechless. Bremen was reduced to rubble. Streets once filled with cars were now buried in debris. Smoke, coal dust, the stench of burned metal. Germany was no longer a nation of engineers, but a land of people searching for their foundations. Karl stood in a ruined square, listening to the murmurs around him. We've lost forever. But he knew, no one loses forever, if they are willing to learn. A few weeks later, Karl was hired at a U.S. Army motor pool on the outskirts of Bremen, where the Allies managed transport vehicles, jeeps, and heavy machinery for reconstruction. The officer in charge was a young American captain, John Parker, a Normandy veteran. Reading his file, Parker looked up and smiled. "You worked as a mechanic at Camp Hearn, Texas?" "Yes, sir." "Good. We need men like you. Start tomorrow." From then on, Karl picked up his wrench again, firing up the same familiar jeeps. But now he was no longer a prisoner. He was helping rebuild Germany, even if working for the occupying forces. In the shop, he worked alongside young Germans, 18, 20 years old, a generation raised in war who had never touched modern machinery. Karl taught them the smallest things. Always prioritize simplicity. A single bolt used in 10 places. That's smart. A beautiful design you can't repair. That's foolish. He used the Willys MB itself as a teaching tool. Within days, the young men could disassemble and reassemble it with confidence. Karl saw a spark in their eyes, the same spark he once had in his youth, before war turned engineering into a tool for killing. After the war, millions of Germans returned from the front lines, from POW camps, from foreign lands. They had nothing. No homes, no factories, no faith. But among them were those who carried something invisible. Knowledge. Knowledge of how the other side had won, through machines, organization, and a philosophy of production. Karl Reinhardt was one of them. He meticulously documented every American maintenance process, every parts inventory method, every U.S. system based on the standard operating procedure. Then he translated it all into German for his apprentices. One evening, Captain Parker asked him, "Karl, if you could design a vehicle for the new Germany, what would you do differently?" Karl thought for a moment, then said, "I'd take the American philosophy, but build it in the German way. Keep the precision, but eliminate the complexity. Maintain discipline, but let workers master the craft without being trapped by narrow specialties." Parker smiled. "That's exactly what we hope you'll learn." Amid the ashes of Europe, the Americans launched the Marshall Plan, a massive aid package worth over $13 billion, equivalent to more than $150 billion today. The goal wasn't just to fight hunger, it was to rebuild industry, turning former enemies into economic allies. In West Germany, thousands of American specialists trained German engineers in production planning, supply chain management, and technical standardization. They brought with them the philosophy that had won the war: mass production, simplified processes, interchangeable parts. The Germans, with their strong engineering base, absorbed it quickly and made it their own. Karl was invited to join a civilian mechanical training program run by U.S. Command. There, he taught young workers about American-style maintenance, regular servicing, quick part replacement, no need to wait for an expert. He often told his students, "In the war, we lost because we thought engineering was only for geniuses. But the Americans proved engineering must serve ordinary people. Otherwise, it's just an expensive toy." That line was later quoted in the memoir of one of his students, who would go on to become an engineer at Volkswagen. From small classrooms like those, West Germany's industrial revival began. Makeshift workshops slowly became factories. Old Jeeps became models for the first post-war civilian vehicles. In 1947, the Volkswagen factory in Wolfsburg was restored under British supervision, restarting production of the Type 1, later known as the Beetle. And notably, many of the engineers in that program had worked with Americans, learning production standardization from men like Karl Reinhardt. By late 1948, Karl was appointed technical supervisor of Bremen's vehicle workshop. He oversaw more than 60 young German workers. He didn't speak much, just repeated one familiar line. "It doesn't need to be perfect, just precise enough to scale." At first, the youth didn't understand. But over time, they realized, in production, repeatability mattered more than one-of-a-kind craftsmanship. And from there, a new foundation was laid. In the post-war years, West Germany began to change. Pride gave way to humility. Showmanship gave way to pragmatism. They had learned the most costly lesson of the 20th century, a lesson Karl Reinhardt and his comrades had learned in the desert back in 1942. Victory doesn't go to the best, it goes to those who adapt the fastest. One winter afternoon in 1949, Karl wiped grease from his sleeves and looked at the neat row of Jeeps in the workshop. Machines that had once been trophies of war were now tools of peace, carrying materials, aid, workers, and engineers to rebuild the nation. He smiled. "This vehicle has taught me more than 10 years of apprenticeship ever did." And in the fading twilight, he gently started an old Willys. The Go Devil engine hummed softly, like the heartbeat of a new world being born again. In 1950, Germany was split in two. In the West, under the protection of the US and its allies, the Federal Republic of Germany was formed, with a temporary capital in Bonn. In the East, under Soviet influence, the German Democratic Republic emerged. Two different paths began from the same pile of ashes. In Bremen, Karl Reinhardt was now in his 40s, his hair tinged with gray, his hands still greasy with engine oil. He worked for the Northwest Transportation Reconstruction Bureau, overseeing maintenance of motor vehicles, mostly American-made leftovers from the war. But to him, every Jeep or Dodge truck was more than just a machine. It was a living lesson in the philosophy that had saved America, and was now saving Germany. In the early 1950s, West Germany was exhausted, lacking fuel, raw materials, and capital. But it had two priceless things: discipline and a willingness to learn. And from that, combined with experience from America, an economic miracle began. They called it the Wirtschaftswunder, the German economic miracle. The Volkswagen factory in Wolfsburg, once used to build Kübelwagens during the war, was restored. Former workers now stood beside assembly lines producing a small car with a 131cc engine and 25 horsepower, the Volkswagen Type 1, the Beetle. In 1952, Karl visited Wolfsburg on a business trip. From a balcony, he watched the line in motion. Hundreds of workers, each doing one task, with conveyors moving parts in a steady heartbeat rhythm. A young engineer explained, "We're following the Ford model. Every part is standardized. A door on line 3 fits a body on line 8 without adjustment." Karl nodded. "That's exactly what I saw in America in 1943. You're on the right path." In just 10 years, from 1948 to 1958, West German car production increased tenfold. Over 1 million Beetles were produced, making Germany the center of the European auto industry. The American production philosophy, simple, modular, scalable, merged with German precision, creating a new kind of strength. Factories like Siemens, Bosch, BMW, and Daimler-Benz adopted standardized production management, emphasizing repeatability and quality control. By the late 1950s, West Germany surpassed even Britain in exports. A nation once devastated had become a symbol of recovery in the free world. For Karl Reinhardt, it was a deep, quiet satisfaction. He looked at his former students, those young men who once learned to repair jeeps in a motor pool. Now engineers, plant managers, factory directors. When they met him, they still called him Master Karl, the German who trained in Texas. One afternoon in 1955, in Bremen, Karl reunited with Captain John Parker, now retired, working at Ford. They sat drinking beer, looking over the harbor. Parker said, "I hear you've built the best-selling car in Europe." Karl laughed. "Yes, a little bug, but it carries the future." Parker asked, "So you taught them how to fix cars the American way?" Karl shook his head. "No. I only taught them that engineering must serve people, not the pride of engineers." Both men laughed, then sat quietly, listening to ship horns and truck engines, the rhythm of a new Germany. As production soared, life changed. Workers' wages doubled in just 6 years. Bremen, Hamburg, Cologne, Munich blossomed again. Across European roads, streams of Beatles and Opel records rolled endlessly. Like the old Jeep, they weren't flashy, but they were reliable, efficient, easy to repair, and easy to build. The world was amazed by Germany's rapid recovery. But for people like Karl Reinhardt, it was no mystery. They simply applied a people-focused industrial mindset. In 1958, Karl was invited to teach at the Bremen Vocational School. He launched a course titled Modern Mechanics and the American Maintenance Philosophy. In the classroom, young post-war students listened intently. Karl spoke of Camp Hearn, the TM-9803 manual, Sergeant Bill Andrews, and the Willow Run factory. He said, "Never underestimate simplicity. One standard bolt can save hundreds of hours of labor. A clear design can save lives in war, and in peace, it can save an entire economy." The room fell silent. It wasn't just a mechanical lesson, it was a life philosophy. Karl's students would go on to become the backbone of Germany's major industrial firms in the 1970s and 80s, carrying within them a fusion of German precision and American pragmatism. That combination turned West Germany into Europe's industrial powerhouse. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the U.S. entered the age of consumerism. But the principles that once created the Jeep, simplicity, durability, mass production, still ruled the world. One spring day in 1960, Karl walked through a newly rebuilt street near the Bremen harbor. Along the curb, Volkswagens, Mercedes, and BMWs purred quietly. He smiled, realizing the sound of those engines shared the same rhythm he had once heard in Texas, in the North African desert, in machine shops across the globe. It was the sound of continuity, from Jeep to Beetle, from defeat to rebirth. In the worn notebook he had carried since the war, Karl wrote his final line. "We lost because we believed engineering was the pinnacle, but we rose again by learning that engineering only matters when it serves people." He closed the notebook and looked up at the golden evening sky. Above, a DC-6 airliner bearing the Lufthansa logo passed overhead, a symbol of a Germany that had risen again, having learned the hardest lesson from its own defeat. 1976. The world looked nothing like it had 3 decades earlier. The Cold War split the globe in two, but in Western Europe, the Autobahn bustled with cars and commerce. Germany had risen again. Karl Reinhardt, now nearly 70, lived in a small home in Bremen. He still kept with him the sand-colored notebook he had started in the North African desert in 1942. He occasionally visited the vocational school, still wore his old mechanic's coveralls, and still shook each student's hand with oil-stained fingers. The younger generation called him Old Carl of the Jeep, because every lesson began the same way. You know, I once learned engineering from the enemy. And then he would retell the story of lifting the hood of the Willys MB, of the multicolored wires, the four-wheel lever, of Camp Hearn in Texas, and of Sergeant Bill Andrews. Though he had told it hundreds of times, the classroom always fell silent. Not just because it was a story of war, but because it was a story of humility. By the mid-1970s, Germany had become the third largest industrial power in the world, behind only the US and Japan. From rubble, they had rebuilt factories, cities, and lives. And throughout the assembly lines and engineering principles, echoes of the Jeep philosophy still lingered: simplicity, durability, efficiency. The Volkswagen Beetle, symbol of post-war rebirth, had hit 1 million units by 1955 and surpassed 20 million by 1972, becoming the best-selling car in history. It was the spiritual descendant of the Willys MB: small, accessible, easy to fix, easy to build. Like the Jeep, the Beetle wasn't just a car, it was a philosophy for a new era. In 1976, the US Army officially ended Jeep military production, replacing it with the more modern HMMWV. Upon hearing the news, Carl simply smiled. 35 years of service, it fulfilled its mission, but the lessons it taught never got old. Those lessons weren't in metal, but in mindset, in how people viewed the relationship between engineering and humanity. In 1980, Carl received an invitation from a military museum in Hamburg to attend the opening of a new exhibit: World War II battlefield vehicles. In the main hall, surrounded by tanks and aircraft, stood a fully restored Willys MB, painted olive drab, with a small gear lever and a polished dashboard. Under the spotlight, the silver lettering read, Willys MB, 1942. Carl stood silently for a long time. The desert wind, the blazing sun, the moment he first realized the difference between German and American engineering, all came flooding back. A young reporter asked, "Sir, of all the machines you've worked on, was this the best?" Carl shook his head. "No, German vehicles were better, in other ways. But this one was smarter. It didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to survive. And it outlived the empires built to fight it. The world was entering an era of standardization and mass production. From car factories to computers, aircraft to home appliances, everything followed the philosophy Jeep had embodied since 1941. Make things easy to build, easy to fix, easy to understand. That was the spirit of American industry. Practical, straightforward, people-focused. And when the Germans adopted it, blending it with their own precision and meticulousness, it became the most effective production model in the modern world. In 1990, the Berlin Wall fell. After nearly half a century, Germany was reunited. Carl, then 83, watched the news from his small living room. On screen, American aid vehicles, jeeps, trucks, bulldozers, rolled into East Berlin to help rebuild the streets. He chuckled and softly said, "We're starting again, with these wheels." To Karl Reinhardt's generation, the Jeep wasn't just a symbol of the victors. It was a teacher, one that taught the difference between pride and effectiveness, between engineering to impress and engineering to serve. It proved that sometimes simplicity is the highest form of intelligence. In 1998, in Munich, the last reunion of surviving Afrika Korps veterans took place. Only a little more than 20 remained. Their hair was white, their hands trembled, but their memories were sharp. After the ceremony, they visited a Willys MB on display at the German Museum of Technology. They stood silently around it. One said, "I drove one like this at El Alamein. Never broke down, even with sand choking the engine." Another added, "I fixed one in Tunisia. That's when I knew we'd lose." They all laughed, then fell quiet. Karl Reinhardt, now in a wheelchair, slowly reached out and touched the hood. His voice was raspy but clear. "We didn't lose for lack of courage. We lost because we didn't understand what efficiency meant. And this vehicle taught us that." The Willys MB Jeep, a humble machine from a massive industrial force, did more than fight a war. It taught the world how to think about production, about engineering, about people. The German mechanics who first opened its hood in 1942 didn't just see an engine. They saw the future, a future where simplicity, standardization, and scalability would shape the 20th century. From North Africa to Wolfsburg, from Camp Hearn in Texas to the highways of Berlin, the Jeep had traveled far as a messenger of American industrial spirit. And perhaps its greatest legacy wasn't helping one side win a war, but helping the defeated learn how to rise and rebuild a nation. In 2000, Karl Reinhardt passed away in his sleep at the age of 93. On his small gravestone in Bremen, they engraved a line from his wartime journal: "Engineering only matters when it helps people move forward." The Jeep, America's small machine, became humanity's great lesson. It didn't just carry soldiers into battle, it carried a philosophy that in war or peace, true wisdom lies in making things simple, useful, and enduring. A vehicle, a philosophy, a lesson for the century.